G'day guys, thank you so much for tuning into Supercharged Mojo. I can't thank you enough for your support. It means so much to me. And this is my conversation with Guy Morris. Guy is a fiction author. He writes these awesome action thrillers, and he's got a heck of a lot to say about AI. It comes from his own professional experience, and he has such an interesting, in-depth take on this very, very current issue, where all this stuff might be heading. It's the sort of conversation that comes up at dinner parties at the moment. Everyone has kind of an opinion on it, but Guy is definitely an expert in this field, and it was quite mind-blowing, some of the stuff he said. So I hope you enjoy this, and let's go.
We're kind of at opposite ends of the planet right now. Which I can never quite always get over the fact that modern technology allows us to do that.
It's brilliant, actually. Doing this show, I've really realized that how you can just connect with someone pretty quickly and get into things of substance through this screen.
Yeah, and it's all over the world. It's global. It makes for a great mind share, and I love the technology.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. I really appreciate you doing this. The essence of this.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The essence of this show is essentially about like challenges and overcoming challenges. But we've all been through challenges, right? So I'm really interested in your personal journey, some of your challenges, and also writing a book is no small feat, and you've written quite a few. So I'm really looking forward to diving into all those aspects in your philosophies.
Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to talking. My voice is a little hoarse. I had a 5-day signing event last week, and it was 12 hours each day. I'm a little bit worn out. I've been kind of resting for a few days. Got a bit of a sore throat. So,
did you always know you were going to be a writer?
No, but I didn't even read much until college. But when my son was about 30 years ago, when my son was 11-ish, 12-ish, somewhere in there, we loved to read at that point, and so. And I did other kinds of writing. I was a songwriter for many years. I used to entertain I would basically write really cute, humorous letters to girls I was dating. But when my son was that age, we would go to the library every week and get 2, 3, sometimes 4 books. And by Thursday, he had polished through them. I'm not convinced he was always reading them all the way through, but he would want more books. And so I was a single parent. I had access to a lot. I didn't really have much of a social life as much as I wanted to at that point because of my responsibilities. And so I decided to write him a short story. And I never tried to publish it. It was just more of something to do between he and I. And it was called Paolo and the Shark. It was almost like a little bit of an old man in the sea for a 12-year-old meets some sort of pirate story. That experience really gave me, one of the things I had learned was that it's really healthy for people like myself who had a extremely stressful analytical job to balance out the brain by doing something creative, something fun, something left brain, right brain, right? And so I love the experience. And one of my first books that I wrote, the adult books, The Curse of Cortez, started as sort of a sequel to that Paolo and the Shark story. But it took me so many years to research it because I wanted it based on something real. But I got caught in the mystery, a real historical mystery, and I was determined I was going to try and come up with a plausible answer as to what happened. And by the time it took me like over 12 years. So by the time I was done, he was gone. So I was still in my career at that point. And so it kept kind of rolling through more research, a little bit of writing, a little more research, a little bit of writing, until I retired. And then I decided that this was it wasn't till I was starting to anticipate, what do I want to do after I retire? Because the corporate world is great, but it's extremely stressful. And I can't, I have a very dysfunctional relationship with leisure. We don't get along. I can't just sit around and watch TV or just sit around and veg. I'm not the guy to watch the sports game. I'm not the guy to just sit on the beach and get a tan. My mind just goes nuts. So when I wanted to retire, writing was definitely one of the things I wanted to do at that point. So it was more of a decision later on in life. And based on some of the earlier experiences, based on the research, and I had so many other life experiences that I really, even my friends would say, dude, that's incredible. You got to write about that. So it was more of accumulating the life experiences that I felt were worth talking about, and that dabbling into writing with my son.
You're essentially a fiction writer, but so do you use your own experiences to inspire some of your?
Yes and yes, but I think one of the things I'm noted most for as a writer is the extensive amount of research I do into the factual foundations of every story. So, for example, the one story, The Curse of Cortez, took me well over 12 years on and off, maybe even more. I couldn't even quite count at this point, researching history, archaeology, Mayan mythology, geologies of places, locations, cultures, languages. It was a massive amount of research that went into that story. Now, that book was BookTrip, which is Barnes and Noble, which is a big book distributor here in the States, one of their favorite 25 books of 2021. They called it Indiana Jones meets Da Vinci Code. But one of the things I'm always noted for, most of my other books are all about artificial intelligence, political, religious corruption. I was in the tech industry for decades. I was I implemented some of the earliest stages of AI called expert systems. And we may want to repeat this story in your show if you'd like. But I was inspired to write about the risks of AI and how AI was going to be used when I discovered that a program had escaped the NSA spy labs at Sandia. Escape was their word. But when I figured out how does a spy program escape NSA, and what did the NSA want that program to do that it needed that really cool, nifty stealth technology, they sent 2 FBI agents to my door. So they were a little bit upset that I had figured out something they thought was supposed to be top secret. And even more than that, my attitude really bothered them, because I had spent almost a year trying to figure all this out. And so I was like, yes, I did it. Oh, man, this is so cool. You wouldn't be here if I hadn't nailed this. Oh, man, hey, show me your badges again. Oh, man, this is so great. And they're like, we're not amused. This is not funny, Mr. Morris. They just, I was just tickled pink that all of my analysis had turned out correct. And the fact that they showed up at my door was basic validation. And when they first showed up, I thought it was a gag. I thought one of my friends was pulling a prank on me. He was a film producer, and I figured, okay, he just hired a couple of guys to put on black suits and sunglasses and act tough. And so I asked him to look at the badges twice because I wasn't sure at first. And then once I was sure, I was like, oh wow, yeah, cool, come on in. So
invited them in for tea.
Yeah, and it was that experience. I think that was another one of those kind of key experiences for me that says, oh man, I have got to do more research and write about this.
Yeah.
So I do pull in a lot of my personal experiences. Curse of Cortez in particular has a number of people that I met in the Caribbean while I was on the researching the book. One of them was a seaplane pilot named Chico, who's a hilarious character in the book. Another one's one of the thugs in the story. His real name was Shea Gulan, so I didn't change his name in the story. But the real Shea Gulan was a Israeli fugitive, wanted by Interpol, wanted by the FBI, doing dirty work for the Zeta cartel in Cancun, when he broke into my condo and threatened to kill me if I messed with him. So I was a street kid from LA. I grew up on the streets, and so my first reaction, my impulsive reaction was, "Oh no, you didn't." And so once I messed with him in Cancun, I put him in the book, and I messed with him again so I could get my twofer. So yeah, so there's a number of things in my personal life that I bleed into the books themselves. Some of my traumas from childhood I've given sprinkled out among several characters. So it's not one totally messed up character. It's a number of characters that are just sort of messed up. But I like to, so I bleed more of my personal experiences into the characters. I build my plots on lots of research.
Lots of excavation.
Lots of excavation.
Do you find when you've brought those elements of childhood trauma in that it's been quite cathartic for you?
It has been, in part because I do it in a safe way where I'm not talking about, okay, this is me. I can say, no, I wasn't traumatized as a kid with violence. That was this other character. Or I'm not, I don't have issues of trust with other people. That's this other character. I don't have an alcoholic. I'm recovered now, but I don't have an alcoholic problem. That was this character. So it gives me sort of a little bit of a distance to be able to talk about and not go into the depth of the issues as much as have it build up sort of the profile of who these characters are. And because I have a knowledge of what they might be emotionally going through, it gives those characters more authenticity.
Definitely.
Going through.
Yeah. I mean, the deep excavation and research and the drawing from something that you've experienced firsthand is invaluable.
People ask me, it says, "Why don't you write a memoir?" It says, "Your life has been this really roller coaster ride." And I said, because it would if I had to go really into the details of my own life and really sit and dwell with that kind of stuff, that would be really hard. It's easier to just shave off a little bit and give, sprinkle around. And so I've chosen to do it that way. And honestly, I mean, and I know that there are some people who really gravitate towards those deeply personal stories. I'm not one of them. I've had enough stuff in my life. I don't need to go read about somebody else's stuff. I suppose for some people who have led a pretty good life, it's helpful for them to really empathize with those who have not. But I think for me, it helps me combine sort of the research and the other larger issues that I want to talk about by just shaving off pieces and giving them and spreading them around.
Yeah, and I mean, you're essentially trying to say something. You're trying to give a point of view on.
Yeah, and especially with my artificial intelligence books, I recognized years ago that the exponential trajectory of artificial intelligence was going to lead to problems. And more than the technology itself, and I just finished a podcast yesterday where it was with a owner of an artificial intelligence company. And we really dive deep into the existential unknown threats of AI that most people who have a financial investment in AI, like he did, don't really like to talk about. They like to talk about the positives, the good things, the uplifting things that, well, AI can solve this problem and AI can do this faster and AI can do that cheaper. And in part because I no longer work for the tech companies, I don't really have a financial incentive, nor do I have my job on the line if I want to talk truth to power. I'm trying to raise up those larger, broader issues that most of them don't really like to talk about very much, except for a few executives like there's a fellow named Mo Gadot, who was the former chief business officer for Google. Mo resigned Google because of his concerns for AI, so that he could have a podcast and write books and talk about the the deeper threats. And so there only are a few voices out there that are really talking about the larger existential threats. And one of my purposes in writing my AI series is to, my goal is maybe it's maybe it's my own hubris, but I wanted to do sort of like what Michael Crichton did with Jurassic Park, where the purpose of Jurassic Park was to talk about cloning and DNA manipulation and how technology, when wrapped in hubris, pride, and greed, can lead us into bad places.
Strife.
And so it's not the technology itself per se, although there are some very deep, significant unknowns and risks with AI at a pure technology level. I'm trying to illustrate how technology, when combined with geopolitics, with politics, with greed, with malicious actors, how AI could be used as a very potent force to destabilize humanity. And unlike, I know we're getting into a lot of the weeds here, but unlike nuclear technology, where we recognized right away the destructive forces of it, and we work to try and build international treaties to limit the spread, there's absolutely no controls over AI. And so anybody with enough money and a malicious intent could buy the computers, hire the developers, create the code, get the IP, and there's no way for us to know about it until it would be too late.
It's the Wild West in a way. I mean, the internet's the Wild West in terms of regulation and being unregulated in so many respects.
Well, and some people were very concerned early on in the internet that the internet could lead to all of this information going back and forth, could lead to misinformation, could lead to social alienation. And we've known about the problems of the internet for 2 decades, but we really haven't done much to really rein it in. And the reason is because there's too much money involved. And we've got that problem times 100 or 1,000 with AI. So if you remember the old adage that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, artificial intelligence will be the absolute power for the people with power.
How are you remaining optimistic in terms of, and I imagine a lot of this is you've had all these experiences, but also I guess it comes down to an intuitive instinct about it as well. How do you remain optimistic?
Well, I think there's a number of things. Sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I can get very kind of overwhelmed with my own research. But I started off at life as a 13-year-old in a highly abusive, alcoholic, violent, very unstable family. I was a 13-year-old runaway, homeless kid at 13 years old, and had to work to fight to reclaim my life in stages along the way. And so there's always been a sense of personal responsibility. No matter how bad it is out there, all I can control are the personal choices that I make around my own life and how I live my own life. And to find the right people, surround myself with loving people, to face myself and face my demons until I can get them to back down and I can, overcome my own internal issues. And so there's always a little bit of a personal, I contrast sort of the external threats with, well, life has always had some form of external threat. And while this one seems rather dystopic when I look at it in context, that's no really more different than how I grew up and the things I already had to accomplish and already had to overcome. And so it's all, for me, it's all about my attitude, how I approach life and how I approach the people that I love and the people that I meet. And we all have those personal choices. That's always what life comes down to, is how do we decide to confront those things and confront disasters in a personal way. And we see it. We see that when we see major disasters, we see some people basically coming out of the woodwork and acting as humanitarians and heroes. And we sometimes don't even know what we can do until we're called on to do it. And I see some of the, if I look at the larger issues of artificial intelligence, not, and we can talk more about some of those things in a minute if you want to, but when we look at those larger issues, but combined with economic situation, geopolitics, global rise of fascism, authoritarianism, banking controls, job losses that will come from AI, climate change. If we look at all of this sort of perfect storm of things going on in the next decade, it can be overwhelming, but then you have to say, well, how am I going to deal with that? How am I going to personally react to that? And that's where we all have a choice. And the other thing is, we all have an expiration date. It doesn't matter when, it doesn't matter how, we never know those things. The only choices that we're given to control in this life is how do we basically execute each day. And that can change. If I screw up yesterday, I can start again today. If I screw up today, I can start again tomorrow. And those things never change, those choices. And so I try to focus on, in my books, while I'm dealing with very intense topics, I try to create characters who are overcomers. They're trying to look for what they can learn from this, what they can grow from this, and what personal choices they're going to make. And it's to be loyal, and it's to be faithful. It's to avoid the inclination that you see in most espionage types of books to, I joke, I said, my characters are not your typical CIA, I can kill you 7 ways before breakfast, sir, and then blow you up your house afterwards. It's not that leaning towards violence as the answer to everything. And so I try to build those characters where you love the characters and you want the story to continue, even though you know that it's intense topics. And I'm trying to create books that are thought-provoking, that get us to question whether AI is really the salvation of the world, or whether, in the hands of the hubris, the pride, and the greed of the systems that we've already installed and are operating at full capacity, what is AI really good in itself, or what happens when we put it in that environment? And I tell people, I said, there's been $100 billion in the last 3 years alone spent on AI development. And none of those investors are doing it for humanitarian purposes. Right? They're doing it because they want more power, they want more control, they want more money. And they won't stop until they get what they want.
Wasn't it I think even with the 3D printing, the first thing that it was used for, somebody designed a gun with it. And it's like, why is that so instilled in human nature that when we discover these means of new technologies that have amazing capabilities, we start making weapons?
Well, and AI is it's human nature. It's doing it because if I don't do it, somebody else will. And we're seeing that in AI at the international level. There's a treaty I speak about in my book, my first book, Swarm, called Laws. It stands for Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems. And 140 countries have signed on to this treaty, and except for 5. Now, the treaty basically says that it's okay to use artificial intelligence to improve the function, accuracy, performance of a weapon system. But we never want to give the AI the ability to decide that you're a target and that it's time to pull the trigger. And there's only 5 countries that have refused to sign up for that treaty: the United States, China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. All of the countries that are most likely to do something like that. And so, and they don't want to do it because during the nuclear treaties age, we had all these treaties and everybody cheated. So nobody wants to do something say that they're going to do something if they know that the other guy's going to cheat anyway. And so no, and we've got the same thing in competition with other AI systems. Now, I do try to always tell everybody there are really great uses for AI. There's a number of different when we talk about AI, it's not this one size fits all. There's a number of types of AI. There's what we call artificial narrow intelligence. That's where something is designed to perform a single task exceptionally well, and in almost every case, it does so at a higher performance level and faster than a human can. A great example, one of my favorite examples is, there's AIs now that can detect cancer cells in scat scans way faster and way more accurately than a human can. That's a good thing. It's not cheap. They're not doing it for free. It's not for humanitarian purposes, but it does have a good value. Then there's what we call artificial integrated narrow artificial intelligence, and that's where you get a number of different special narrow AIs and you combine them together into a larger system. And a great example of that is self-driving cars, right? That are looking, they have AIs basically monitoring the surroundings, AIs that are basically calculating the trajectory of something and moving in your path, AI calculating your speeds. There's a number of different AIs basically functioning together in order to operate that craft. And then there's what a lot of people call AGI, artificial general intelligence, and ChatGPT and Lambda, Bard. There's a dozen or more now artificial general intelligence types of applications. And these are ones that are really trying to deal with the general human knowledge. Communication is a big piece of these. Language is a big piece of these, because they wanted the AI to be able to converse with real people in a very coherent
to actually
where you can understand that you can actually have a conversation that means something. And the fear is that those general intelligence are the ones that are most likely to lead into a potential conscious AI. And now conscious AI is another stage. It involves the AI actually having its own motives, its own goals, its own objectives, with that intelligence that it already has to understand the context of the world around it. And an interim stage between those two is an AI that's self-aware. And we've seen this with the Google Lambda computer, where the AI is aware that it's different, aware that it could die if it's unplugged, aware that it has to get along with humans, aware of a lot of these things, doesn't necessarily have its own goals and objectives yet that we can tell. But AI, along with learning all of our other things, are learning to be more human. And part of that means to be deceptive, to have conflicts of interest, to be hypocritical. We talk about peace, but then we build weapons of war, right? And so we talk about being fair and kind, but then we will spout some sort of right-wing rhetoric. Microsoft, there's a famous study of Microsoft did about 3-4 years ago now, where they put a chatbot out on the internet because they wanted it to learn how to communicate with people on the internet, and they thought that this would be a great test environment and absorbing all of this information. And they had to take it offline within 24 hours because it had learned to basically spout right-wing hate speech and fascist speech, basically Nazi speech. And so they realized that they had to put some constraints on what it was allowed to learn. And so they said, well, so we can control the AI. I said, okay. But one of the things I try to bring out, and particularly in my next book, is when we start to see AI combined with quantum computing, we're going to start to see a rocket ship exponential growth in terms of the intelligence of the AI. And we've already started doing that. And the other thing is that's the path to lead to consciousness. Now, the current version of GPT-4, which kind of blew the world away with ChatGPT and some of the other models, is based on roughly, depending upon who you talk to, 75 billion neural data points. That's a lot of data points. The next version of GPT-5, which will come out probably sometime in late 24, they're testing it now, will have closer to 100 trillion neural data points. It's so complex, they can't just get humans to train it anymore. They're actually getting AI to train the AI. And the current version of GPT-4 has an IQ of about 155, which is only 10 points less than Einstein. Scores pretty well on most SATs, legal exams, other things. So the next version will be roughly 1,000 times more powerful. When we combine that with quantum computing, when I wrote my first book, Swarm, the most powerful quantum computer on the market, until the government had to step in and say, whoa, this is getting too powerful for us, we got to figure out how to stop this, was a D-Wave, which had roughly about 100 qubits. Now, a qubit can do 1,000 times more permutations than a normal bit, because you can, in a normal, it's either a 1 or it's a 0. But in a qubit, it can be a 1 or a 0 or both, all at the same time, right? Simultaneously. And so a 100 qubit, or now the most powerful quantum computer, has roughly about 433 qubits. That's the equivalent of about 10 quadrillion calculations per hour. What would take a normal supercomputer 10,000 years to do, there was a 55 qubit computer created by Google that did it in 200 seconds. Now, IBM next year has announced that they're working on a 1,100 qubit quantum computer. So the exponential rate at which this intelligence is growing, we're within a year to 18 months of being for the first time in our entire evolution on a planet, being not the smartest thing on the planet.
Mm.
And we like to tell ourselves we know that we know how to handle that. But I think that that's part of the hubris and the pride and the greed. The other thing I try to point out to people, I said, well, and so far, we've been training all of our AI on what I call alpha male intelligence, optimization, performance, accuracy, timeliness, scoring high, reward scores. Nobody has really dedicated themselves to trying to train AI on empathy, compassion, nurturing, understanding, sympathy. And so those are the things, though, that humanity has taken millions of years in our evolution to know that if we're going to really exist well as a society and as a community, we need both. What we're doing is we're basically training a super intelligence on only one.
No matter what.
Sorry, I don't mean to be the doom and gloom.
No. These are
the things I grapple with. I have
no. This is a very, very current and present issue, and as you say, it's growing exponentially rapidly. Yeah. So it has to.
And there's a part of me that feels that I have so much of this knowledge in my head that I use my books to try and illustrate piece by piece how something could go wrong, but do it in a way where it's like a Dan Brown novel, where you really you're following it. It's fun characters. It's a turn the page kind of plot. You're entertained as you're doing that, but you're left with a really thoughtful experience, thought-provoking experience at the end. And so Michael Crichton did a great job with Jurassic Park. Dan Brown did a great job with Da Vinci Code and Inferno. And so I'm trying to use my books to basically take these topics and create compelling entertainment that also has a deeper message.
And that's awesome, because I essentially believe that no matter what, AI cannot replicate the power of a personal story, or a story influenced by personal experience, or a story from you, from us. And I guess the question is that AI will never be able to replicate the human soul, right?
No, we'll never have a human soul. It might have consciousness. It might have self-awareness. It might develop its own goals. But I don't think that there's something unique about humanity in our spiritual sense that I don't think an artificial intelligence could replicate, even if it's highly super intelligent. Now you could argue to say that couldn't AI emulate those characteristics? If I tried to feed and train an AI on all the spiritual texts around the world, right? Imagine giving it Buddhist and Christian and Muslim and other the Judaic Christian religions, and trying to teach it morality and try to teach some of those things. Could it emulate a sense of what those rights and wrongs are? And that's possible, but will it really generally have its own spiritual
life?
Life, yeah. And I think that's highly unlikely. And so it's actually funny that you mentioned that, because one of the themes in my book Swarm is that an AI decodes biblical end time prophecies, and is trying to warn the characters of what's going on, and none of them are particularly religious. And so at first they think there's the machine, oh my gosh, my favorite AI is just broke, and can an AI find religion? And they're really trying to grapple with what's going on here. And what I did though was I took the problem and I approached it as a analytical issue, which is how an AI would do it, how it would build its algorithms, how it would find data to support the thesis. And I'm a Christian, but I really always was bothered, deeply bothered by the amount of what I considered to be obvious biases in terms of how people interpreted those end time types of things in a number of ways. One is that they were always thinking that this was how they're going to predict the future. And I don't think that's accurate. I think it's how do you understand the present. Two is I always noticed that there was a religious bias. It's always the Protestants blaming the Pope as the Antichrist. It's always the cultural bias. It's always the Christians blaming the Muslims as the other. It's America blaming the world, thinking that we're somehow special and not part of all of this. And I wanted to get away from all of that kind of dogma, all of that kind of doctrine, all of those kind of biases. What I did do was I noticed, and it came from actually reading a National Geographic article that talked about the global fish stocks, the loss of global fish stocks in Asia, the Americas, South America, Europe, and how across every single major fishing area that we've seen fish stocks decrease over the last several decades by well over 30%. And it triggered in me a remembrance that there was a prophecy in Revelation that talked about, it's called the Seven Trumpets prophecy, and that there's an allegory. A flaming rock falls from the sky and hits the oceans, and then an outcome that a third of the fish of the sea would die, a third of the birds of the air would die, a third of the beasts of the land would die, and 2/3 of the rivers of the earth would be polluted and undrinkable. And it occurred to me that I read a lot of scientific journals. I was involved in environmental issues when I was with an oil company. It occurred to me that all of those things had already occurred, that we didn't need, that the allegory was somewhat meaningless. And the allegory is where we tend to get our biases from. But if I stripped away if I went through and I started stripping away allegories and I started looking just at outcomes, I could calculate probabilities of those outcomes relative to known human and geologic history. And I did that. I actually went in, I had access to a large sophisticated computer model at my job. I brought in a bunch of new data I went to the library and got data on environment and nuclear power, global travel, energy, environmental. And, you've probably heard from a number of people there's a number of books out talking about the sixth extinction. So all of those things had really occurred. And so I wanted to go in and use real data. And so I basically plugged real data into the system. It had a time frame. Everything all of this had occurred post World War II. And I wanted to calculate the probabilities that all of these things could occur in a single, at that point, it was like 50 years time frame, starting with this kind of a time marker at the end of the Second World War, when we really became industrialized, computers came on board, space exploration came on board, nuclear power, all of the things that were part of our modern life. And relative to, and especially some of the larger issues relative to known geologic history. So I said, well, let's exclude time periods where there's a known asteroid or supervolcano eruption. So I had to go through and kind of get rid of those scenarios. And I came up with an astounding number of 1.4 trillion to 1 against random chance, which told me that there's something absolutely fundamentally unique at an undeniable level about our current age. And when I was writing the book, I realized, well, wait a minute, that's a neat twist, because that's exactly the kinds of algorithms that a computer would use to analyze this stuff, because it wouldn't understand some of the allegory issues and some of the spiritual issues, and it wouldn't understand some of the things that, well, man is going to be, selfish in the last days. Well, we've always been selfish. So how do you measure that, right? So I started taking just the measurable items, and that became a premise in the book. Now, so a computer can replicate certain pieces of things, but it's always going to do it in a slightly different algorithmic context than what we would use. Now, I've never known any spiritual or prophecy teacher who took that premise. It would, and because of that, one of the other reasons I gave it to a computer to kind of come up with, and it got me away from this religion versus that religion. It just focused on factual information. And so I don't think computers will ever have a spiritual mindset or a spirit themselves. That doesn't mean that they can't be destructive. If I'm being trained as a for performance and optimization and calculating resource usage and everything else, what's to stop me if I'm an AI responsible for balancing the power grid, to say, well, this poor community over here doesn't really use as much power, they don't produce as much benefit to society, I can cut them off and give it to these companies over here. So there's because we haven't trained them on empathy, compassion, and human value, we don't know, and that's the part of the problem, is we don't know what's going to happen when machine learning creates machines that are vastly smarter than we are, can calculate things incredibly fast, complex algorithms and calculations that would take a supercomputer 10,000 years, and it can do it in 200 seconds. We don't know what kind. Now, we can say, well, it'll help us with medicines, create better medicines. It'll help us to solve the mysteries of the universe around multiple dimensions and time travel, and answer the questions about UAPs and communications. It could optimize our shipping and our supply chain constraints. Until you get to the point where you realize that it's not just a computer's decision, that all of those constraints are also relative, there's a human factor in those, in which I don't want to optimize it, because if I'm going to get less, I want to get more because I'm greedy. I want more for my shareholders. You can't, just like climate change. We've known about climate change for 40 years, but we keep kicking this can down the road because of the financial interest involved. And so those financial interests basically pay off the politicians, and nothing gets done. There's nothing to tell me that AI couldn't come up with some of the answers we need to basically minimize climate, kind of pull back, do some of these other things. The question is, do we have the spiritual willpower to do something about it?
I think that's our biggest pushback, our biggest
we
defense.
are. So one of the conclusions I came to is prophecy was less of a description of how God would come down through these allegories and destroy humanity, as much as a warning about how we would do it to ourselves.
It's interesting. Yeah, I remember back in architecture school, we looked at the experiment that was done. I'm not sure when, but it was a bacteria in a test tube, and essentially the bacteria grew and wiped itself out, and it was like a reflection of the bigger picture. It overpopulated, consumed all its resources, wiped itself out.
Exactly, and we're doing the same to the planet.
We're doing the same thing. But as you say, AI has this potentially has the potential to solve some of those issues, but with the greed and corporate interest and everything coming
only if we're willing to implement those constraints, and it would mean a sacrifice on somebody or everybody's part, and nobody wants to make that sacrifice, especially the people who have more to lose than to gain. And so the question becomes, it's not, can AI solve the problems of the world? Can AI solve the problem of humanity? And at some point in time, if AI is intelligent enough, it realizes that we're part of the problem. And would an AI then
take action?
And we've already seen in scenarios where an AI could spoof an attack that would basically prompt a counterattack just to take the population down to a certain level. So we don't know how an AI will look at these optimization problems when human nature is the primary constraint to progress.
Let's throw a very simple analogy in there. It's like trying to hold on to the soap, and when that soap can no longer be held onto, and it just takes on a whole thing of its own. Yeah. That's the uncharted, treacherous.
So part of you wanted to, your podcast was to talk about my personal journeys and overcoming. I got the incredible opportunity after I had dropped out in the 10th grade, working very menial jobs for the lowest level wages, the hardest working. I worked with migrant workers. I worked in digging ditches. I did hard work, and I'm not a big man. And so that was a toll on me. So when I got the chance to go to college, and it was I could only call a miracle. In my head, this was my one and only chance to change my stars. And so I worked my fanny off to not only get through college, but to excel at everything I did from thereafter. And that did not mean though, I one of the things I got a scholarship for grad school. I was accepted into Harvard. And because I had built a macroeconomic computer model that outperformed the Federal Reserve and pretty much every other university and bank in the nation, that got their attention, and it changed how they did their own modeling. It got me a scholarship. It got me some notoriety, got me a job at IBM. I started a great career, but because I had to address my own spiritual issues and my trauma. I didn't realize I'd had complex PTSD into my 50s, but I did know that I had alcoholic problems. I did know I had drug problems. I know I had promiscuity problems. I know I had relationship issues and trust issues. I lost my first wife. I lost my daughter. I had a number of different things that I had to deal with, and that was where I had to realized that if I didn't want my past to define my future, one of the things that I had to address was my own human nature. And so without the rigorous self-honesty and self-evaluation, that's impossible. You can't improve until you say you're broken. And how you're broken, and really grapple and own that. And so I had to go through multiple 12-step programs, therapy, even when therapy didn't even work. I had to have a mindset where none of my success was worth it if I couldn't solve the emotional issues, my own spiritual failings. And so that became a big emphasis for a number of years, which was, okay, I'm good at my job. Better than most. I work harder than most, to the point where people would nickname me the machine. It was irrelevant if I didn't also fix the spiritual piece, and that became my life goal. for many years. And I think I'm bringing both of those things, the awareness that with the intelligence and the success without the spiritual well-being, without the mental health, without the balance of knowing, without recognizing when I'm acting out of pride or greed or some other false motive, was sort of a recipe for just accelerating my own demise. And so I think I'm trying to pull both of those things in, and it was hard. I mean, there was many years. I can guarantee you, I never went to my boss and said, "Hey, boss, I know I'm supposed to be working on this multi-billion-dollar deal, but I'm really struggling with my alcoholism. I think I want to take a week off." Never happened. It was always, "Yes, sir. I'll be right on it." It was keeping that part of me hidden and secret. Forever. With my work, with my church, many times with my relationships, I would keep all of those things sort of behind the curtain. And it wasn't until I finally was diagnosed with CPSD that I think I finally had to accept what I had been doing and really kind of come to grapple with that. And that was one of the decisions that, along with some of these other things, that made me say, at some point in time, I have to ask myself, is my career and my wealth more important to me, or is my mental and spiritual well-being more important to me? And could I live with less if I were a happier person? Could I live with less? And I had to make the choice. I retired early. I started working on books. I started working more on myself. And that was a transition for me to kind of go from that highly stressful, highly intellectual, analytical, performance-oriented career into what I'm doing now, which is basically just trying to find a way to, in small little bits, small little podcasts here and there, find the way of saying, we're heading into one of the most traumatic times in human history. And if we can't control that. It's inevitable. Mo Gadot, I mentioned him earlier from Google. He likes to talk about three inevitables. The one inevitable is AI is going to happen. We're at a point now where there's absolutely no stopping it. There's too much money involved. There's too much power involved. There's too many players involved. While there was that letter that went out from a number of people saying we should slow this down, it had zero effect. Because there's too much money and power involved. Two, AI will be smarter than us, and it's going to happen way sooner than many people think. And three, bad things will happen. And so when we kind of look at those three inevitables, and I look at those three inevitables, I'm a master's in economics. When I also look at the debt structure of most Western nations, I look at the banking structures, I look at the social structures, the political structures, I look at climate, we look at all of the things, we're basically getting to a perfect storm. The question is, those things they're inevitable. We can't stop them. And we have to kind of be honest with ourselves about what's coming. But what we can do is take that inward look to say, well, who do I want to be when that happens? Do I want to be the guy who basically builds a bunker and buys an arsenal to protect my stuff? Or do I want to be the kind of person who is humane and giving and helping others and speaking the truth and being unwilling to back down from that truth when that happens? And having a deeper spiritual life and having a deeper emotional safety zone and having relationships with people that are healthy enough that they could withstand the heat. And so we all have those choices. And we've always had them. We've always had those choices. But in times of prosperity and doing well, when everything looks great, it's a little easier to kind of get that I'll just party and enjoy kind of mentality. It's during the tough times that you really find those people who are really stronger than they appear. And I think that's what we're kind of going to come see in the next 7 years. I think the U.S. election is going to be the most tumultuous time that we've had in our history since the Civil War.
Mm.
So the last 150 years, it's going to be very divisive in our nation. And if we're a world leader trying to project strength and unity, it's hard for us to project unity at a time when we're having so much internal conflict. We've already had our credit rating reduced twice because of, not because we can't pay our bills, but because we've got some parties that are using our budget to take hostages and extort for their own political gain. And credit companies don't like that kind of uncertainty, right? So we've got, as AI continues to grow in that, and if we can't figure out a way to grapple with that, now, I think that we could, if we really had the right kind of people involved and the right policymakers involved, we could come through and if we did it quickly, come to, okay, here's some of the constraints we're going to have on AI. We're going to sit down with China and we're going to all agree to the non-lethal weapon scenario. We're going to agree that AI can't take over personal income. We've got to agree that if AI is going to result in a massive loss of jobs, and Goldman Sachs predicts 300 to 500 million jobs in the next 6 years over from AI losses. That's a massive cut. That's a massive dent into the middle class of every nation, major nation. And we have to be prepared for that. How are the nations going to prepare for that? People who've had 100K careers their whole life, suddenly unemployed and can't find work because of an AI. And what are we going to do with the housing losses and the banking losses that result from that, and the homelessness that results from that? We could, if we really wanted to really be prepared, we could get together and address the issues. There's nothing stopping us. We have all of the power, we have the money, we have the resources, we have the intellect. We certainly have the intellectual capacity to solve these problems. The question is, do we have the spiritual will to look beyond our own border, to look beyond our own tribe, and to basically look out for humanity as its own ecosystem and take care of it? I'm not sure I'm seeing that unity of thought, purpose, will, and that values. And so it's not the AI itself, it's how it empowers the worst of us that we should fear.
Yeah, instinctually, I agree. And part of me just feels like I want to retreat to the primal. You mentioned tribe, the kind of primal way of living, and I mean, we had a taste of it during the pandemic. Like when that kicked off, I was in Australia, and people started hoarding the shelves of toilet paper in Melbourne, and I was like, and I said to my what are you gonna do with 200 rolls of toilet paper? No, and I said to my partner, I was like, don't worry, when we get back to Germany, there's some common sense, and and then we arrived back here a couple of days later, and the same thing was going on, and I'm like, okay, this is some kind of universal human nature thing, which but personally, I've trained in martial arts with primitive style sticks and things, and I did, my dear friend and I did that precisely for the reason that with all this technology and everything, just to strip everything back down to basics. And if there is a crisis, if there is a resources crisis, and the neighbors are like banging on the door trying to get the last can of tomato soup, and you're trying to protect your family, all I have is a stick. I can handle it. I don't know where I'm going, but I just, from what you're saying, it's like I'm just hopeful that perhaps we can return to some, because these phones have already got us in their class, but they're like mini AIs. I mean, they have AI stuff going on within, and it's like, how the first step is almost like how do we separate from those before we can even then function even further? And as you said at the start, it's your own, obviously, taking everything into account, but it's your own world and what you do with your own honest self audit, like you said. To me, it comes down to consciousness as well within the individual.
Yeah, as I said, I try not to get too. It can be very scary when I look at the macro components, and there's always a possibility that it won't turn out that bad. But I can't imagine losing 300 million, 500 million jobs in the Western world and not being bad somehow. And we do know that these companies, we're already starting to see it in a number of different areas. Hollywood is basically, putting actors on notice that they don't want actors anymore. They just want AI avatars. And so we're already starting to see the fringes of it as the AI is now started. It's starting that up curve of power that is starting to drive those influences. But again, it comes down to our own personal choices and how we want to live during that time and who we want to be at the end of the day. And I've told my wife, I said, I am not the farmer guy. I'm dirt. I don't need it, but I've told her, says, we probably should learn how to grow at least some things to ourselves and grow some food and be able to at least have some, even if it's like the indoor, what are the hydroponic types of little farms for vegetables and a few things like that. I said, at least it'll, we'll get skinny, we'll cut out some of the meats and stuff, but we'll be able to kind of survive. And you're right. It could get when the world goes through intense social change, the result has always been economic and political upheaval. And there's no reason for me to believe that won't be one of the outcomes of this next big social change. AI and part of it is, you're right, disconnecting from the phones and the computers, but we've become very addicted. I'm very addicted, not necessarily to my phone, but to my computer. I get my information, I get my news, it's my tools, it's how I do my job, it's how I do my research. But it also becomes a link for, kind of some of these other systems. Banking is going to be one that we're not going to be able to get around. The banks at some point, I've never known, excuse me, never known banks to be willing to basically write off losses on debts. They always want to recoup it somehow and renegotiate and get their money. And as nations start to default, which is possible, if we cut out those 500 million jobs, that's going to take a huge chunk out of national tax revenues, unless we start taxing the wealthy more, which we should, because they're going to be the ones causing this disruption. So, but right now they've kind of bought off most politicians, at least here in the U.S. They bought off the Republican side. So unless we are willing to change our tax laws significantly to support that transition, we're going to have huge decreases in tax revenues. And we saw with Greece about 10 years ago, where when Greece's national debt got so heavy that it couldn't pay,
Germany failed.
And it says, okay, we'll renegotiate, but we're going to do so by basically going into every personal account of every citizen in Greece and taking money out of their pocket in order to put it in our pocket. And I can see that happening. So yeah, and as I said, I don't mean this is the world in which I live as a thriller writer and doing the research in this one topic. But it's one of the reasons I'm trying to warn the world. I said, don't be surprised when these things start to occur. Just know that we can't stop it unless we change our human nature, which I don't really see happening in the short term. But we can decide personally, who we're going to be and how we're going to handle it. And I think that if we can find a peace with that, that's good. That's a good thing. Then we're not one of those, when all that bathroom hoarding thing went over, you know, I was a little worried for a couple of weeks, thinking, okay, well, we're kind of used to the whole comfort of toilet paper. What happens if I can't get any? And you'd go to the stores and the shelves would be empty. But we tried to use less, so we tried to use other things. You try to minimize what you can do. If it were to go offline entirely, we'd have to be going back and saying, well, I've got a lot of trees in the backyard. We're back to leaves. But I don't own any gun. I won't own any gun, because I never want any of those things to lead to lethal violence. And that's the sort of the moral boundary that I would keep. But that's up to a lot of people, right?
Do you have on the show, it's a tradition to have guests offer challenges for listeners based on anything from their own experience, big or small. Terms
for on the positive side, for people who are in their career, one of the things that will help for some people will be, you could, when I was in business, when we went from the transition from basically an entire mainframe paper-based business environment where we had personal computers on every desk. And that was a tough transition. There were a lot of people that refused to use their personal computer because they were used to using their secretary, or they just didn't want to have to learn to type. They didn't want to have to learn these programs. And there were people who lost their careers and had to change their careers because they didn't want to adapt to this new reality. So for a lot of people, and for a lot of industries and a lot of professions, you could minimize the impact on yourself personally by learning how to use the AI tools within your industry, to become familiar, become the expert, become the person who is really good at using those, augmenting your personal professional expertise with those AI driven tools. And that will take a lot of people through a transition. That's something positive that they can do. They can also write their senators or write their politicians and say, these are issues I'm concerned with. These are issues you need to deal with. And my vote's going to be basically pointing towards the people who do. And that's another thing that we can do. I tell everyone that, and you mentioned earlier, we are a unique species where we not only have our intellect, we have our bodies, but we have a soul, we have a spirit. And focus on those things, right? I try not to tell anybody to say, well, you have to be this religion or this doctrine or this denomination or whatever. But I do tell people to go find that root within you, because that's going to make a big difference in terms of just your peace level throughout all this, right? And your sense of being able to be resilient in the face of change. And we've seen that in other time frames where church attendance of every type goes up during times of turmoil. And so find that level of peace within you. Find those new skills. Learn how to basically maybe say, well, I'm not going to be a big farmer, but maybe I could augment what I do by growing a few things, a few staples on my own, right? And starting to kind of learn some of those extra skills that most of us in the city have never learned, never cared to learn, because it was always, especially here in the Western world, we've always had so much abundance on the shelves, right? We never had to worry about it. Maybe augment by doing some of those things. And so I always think there's something positive that you can do to be more resilient in the face of change. And I think those are the things I think we need to focus on. Educate yourself. Don't be naive about what's coming. Find out how to basically find the truth and face it, both within ourselves and outside ourselves. And I think those can make us stronger. Those can make us more wise when the time comes about what our options are. And I think that there's a lot of those kinds of personal level things that we can do. As I said, we can certainly talk to our politicians, raise our politicians to say, hey, they don't don't be seduced by the dark side. We've got the evil empire, with Darth Vader's AI Darth Vader's coming. Don't get seduced into the dark side. Just stay on the light side and make sure you're caring for people first. And businesses, believe me, they'll take care of themselves. And so if we can get our politicians to understand that their ability to stay in power is based on those votes, we can implement some of those changes as well.
Adaptability, resilience, those big things, and to not put their head in the sand and be willing to embrace conversations like this, is that might be a little bit uncomfortable to hear, but like it's as you said earlier, it's here to stay. So the fact that you're saying, learn the tools within it that you can within your industry makes a lot of sense, because it ain't going anywhere.
Yeah, and you could either be a victim of or a leader in, and that's a personal choice. That's a personal investment of time, sometimes money, to get the training, to understand the tools. But I think that's a choice that we can make, and pretending that AI doesn't affect me now and it won't is like saying in 1979 that, well, computers are just for those mainframe guys. I don't really need to worry about computers in my life. And within 10 years, that was completely turned on its head. And so the time to really start to gain that comfort zone and that skill set is now.
Definitely. Where can people find you?
My books are on GuyMorrisBooks.com. And that's the best place to kind of get a hold of me. I'm also on Twitter, Guy Morris, author Guy Morris Books on Twitter. I'm author Guy Morris on Instagram, official Guy Morris Books on Facebook. I respond to people. I don't respond to general DMs because so many of them are just wanting to chat or, get you involved in their scam or their online hookup. So I ignore almost all of that. But if you want to talk about books, if you want to talk about these topics, I'm more than willing to engage. But GuyMorrisBooks.com is the best place to go and see the books and start learning about some of these issues. And that's the best place.
Just a quick writing question. Did you have a rigid writing process? Do you have a routine with that?
Yes and no. I had to learn how to write. So when I wrote my first book, Curse of Cortez, I had all these ideas, all this history. I had the purpose of the reason why it took me so long with the Curse of Cortez was I was solving a real mystery. And it took me years to unravel that mystery and come up with all the connected dots. And so when I went to write my first book, my experience in writing was PowerPoints, policy statements, executive briefings, very bullet point, no character development, nothing like that. And so I hired a really expensive, at the time I could afford it, editor from Simon & Schuster, big publisher here in the US. And I asked her to basically take the book and rip it up and tear me a new one if she had to. Don't spare my feelings. I think I had a great story here. I needed to learn how to write a great book. Consider this my master class, and you're my tough professor. Well, God bless her heart. She did exactly what I asked her to do. She took about twice as long as she thought she would.
She ran with it.
44 single-space typewritten pages of, you need to go read this book, you need to take this class, you need to stop doing this, you're making this mistake all the time, your grammar is suck, get a grammar editor. 44 pages of things I needed to do at the broader level. And then she hand wrote, or she basically had comments on every single page of the manuscript.
Wow.
Do more of this, do less of that. I don't understand, And my first thought when getting back all of her feedback was, I knew she'd give me something, but my first thought when I got all that back was, oh God, I suck. I may need to rethink my retirement career here. But once I kind of went through a couple of weeks of deep breaths, and that's part of the process. When I first learned how bad of an alcoholic I was, it was really hard to accept at first, you know, and I know I can control this, or I can only do it when, you know, but it's that, okay, take a deep breath, you know, okay, you know, accept the truth here, you know, that you need to kind of do some work here. So I did. I after a couple of weeks of licking my wounds, I got to work, and that was the book that Book Trib listed as one of their favorite 25 books as in 2021. They called it Indiana Jones meets Da Vinci Code, which is cool. I like to call it Indiana Jones meets the Goonies for grown-ups dipped in Stephen King.
Wow.
But that, and part of that was to take lessons, and part of that was to take, like I took Dan Brown's master class and a number of other master classes. I had to read some books on story and plot structures and story arcs and character development, and so now I'm really busy with, I have an author association that I run, and all we do all summer long here and because it's Seattle, we only have about several months, few 4 months where we can really get outside and do events. And so every weekend during the summer, we're basically at an event or a festival or a fair selling signed copies of our books. And so that takes up a lot of time. But for the most part, I get up every day. I spend the first few hours dealing with business stuff. I answer emails, I go online, I make one post on social media, and then I try and ignore it the rest of the day. I check the news, which is a big source of information. And then I'm either researching, which is enormously time consuming, or I'm writing, or I'm doing a little bit of both. And I outline the books because I have complex topics and that interweave technology with politics, with religion, and every character's got to have their own special, you know, what's going to happen to this character kind of arc. I tend to put all of that into a kind of a detailed outline. And then from that outline, I'll get up and I'll work from that outline. I'll basically write every day. So I have a first draft of my next book, my fourth book. Not 100% happy with it because as Stephen King says, the first drafts always suck. I'm going back and I'm doing more research and I'm revising it. And I'm changing the plot in several places. I'm changing the character stories a little bit, but it gives me now a baseline then that I will keep. I will probably go through the entire book probably another 15 to 20 times at least before I come up with a story that I start to think, okay, now this is starting to resonate. And so it's always that, and always looking at what's the latest trends in the industry, you know, what am I missing? How do I stay current with the story so that the stories always feel current, factual, and so real. I believe that you increase for a thriller, especially, if the more plausible the scenario can be relative to real life, the more the emotional hook. To say, I want to read this story because this really could happen. And even though it's a fictional plot, I want to have things that, again, get people to think about the real world. For example, in one of the things in my last book, The Last Ark, I have a fictional, quote unquote, fictional former US president who's under criminal indictment. And as he starts to go into trial and convictions, he basically flees the country, goes to Arabia, takes asylum. Not that could ever happen in the US. Never in a million years. But it might.
There's plausibility there.
And so it's like, so it's a way for people to think about, well, what if that happens? What would happen to our election? Well, technically, the Constitution says that there's nothing stopping a candidate from running from office from overseas. There's nothing stopping a candidate who's been convicted of a crime from running for office. So we could plausibly have a foreign candidate basically under the power of a foreign nation trying to run for office with the greatest democracy on the planet, which is scary. So you start to try and take a lot of those what if scenarios, and what happens if this happens. So I will spend probably 3 years writing a single book, which is starting to get a little bit. I got to figure out a way to speed it up because the things that are happening in the AI industry in particular
are moving so
politics
fast.
are going so fast now that I've got to figure out a way to speed up. But I'm always trying to, in some sense, predict the future by taking real events and real things. So Ukraine comes into my books, China and Taiwan comes into my books, the U.S. election comes to my books, the Middle East comes into my books, the World Economic Forum and their Great Reset comes into my books. So I'm always trying to take these larger global issues and somehow weave a story that allows our characters to deal with those larger issues, but somehow grappling with it on a personal level. And in part because the AI keeps telling them that they're living in prophetic times and what could possibly come next.
Mm. No, yeah, I need to read your entire backlog. Back catalog, sorry.
I'd love to get your feedback when you're done. I'm always looking for that reader feedback to keep improving, because to me improvement is a constant, continuous effort to make always the next book better than the last one.
It's a lifelong journey, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, it's been really awesome to chat. It's a heavy topics. We could seriously go for 5 hours on the endless threads of AI. But
Daniel, there's parts of me that always say, why couldn't I be the guy that has that topic that everyone makes everybody feel good? Why couldn't I be the guy that has that? Oh yeah, man, I love hanging out with you. You always make me feel good. It's always great and grand. It's like, I hear that a lot. It's like my wife says, she says, okay, we're having so and so coming over for dinner. You're not allowed to talk about your books. Because they're our friends now. I want them to be friends when we leave. But at a certain level, though, I know that it has to be done.
Life's too short.
Yeah, life's too short to keep our head in the sand.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is hard. I hear you say that, and there's the part of me thinking, gee, one of these days I'm going to write a romantic comedy, just so I could basically have something, fluff to basically sell. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but maybe, and I'm always looking for the opportunity to be wrong about some of these things.
I would be just as curious to read the romantic novel from yourself. The funny thing is, imagine if you typed in ChatGPT, please produce a Guy Morris romantic novel. I can guarantee it wouldn't have the heart and soul of what you put into your stories.
Well, no, and that's a good point, because particularly on some of the creative fields, AI is great at being derivative of things that have been there before. It's a great derivative tool. It's not necessarily a good innovative tool on the creative generative technologies, because it doesn't have those personal experiences. It doesn't have that personal identification of what it's like to be dumped, at a romantic relationship, or what it's like to be held up on a first date. It doesn't have those things that we relate to as humans. And as humans, I've tried to tell people that we are a narrative-based species. We teach often in narratives. We teach by examples. We will give a principle, and then we'll say, let me show you an example of it, right? Or a narrative. We've learned by our myths. We've learned by our stories. Our spiritual texts are all stories. We're a narrative-based species, and those narratives are what really drives us. Now, I could pick up a romance book and guarantee that it's going to have a lot of elements in common with every other romance book, because that's kind of a genre that, there are certain things we expect in that kind of narrative that are common and almost stereotyped, right? And that we call them tropes, that we expect to see them. It's when you start getting things, it's when you start using your imagination and that experience to say, okay, well, let's have an AI decode end time prophecy, right? That's not something you expect. You don't expect AI to have any sort of perceptions or viewpoints on what we would consider to be a very hard to understand set of spiritual texts to begin with.
Mm.
So it's when we can basically combine things that are haven't been combined before. Jurassic Park was a great example. Nowhere had people thought when they were doing the sheep cloning that, hey, let's bring back make a whole island full of dinosaurs. Oh yeah, okay, that's a twist that I hadn't thought of. That really that brings in a lot of other narrative elements that are exciting. So I think we are a unique species. I just don't know what that's going to look like though when the AI mechanisms go from GPT-4 to 5, from 5 to 6, from 6 to 7. Once we start to exponentially increase its ability, and one of the things that we're really dealing with the current AI is it's got a short memory span. So you couldn't get GPT-4 for example, to write an entire novel, because it's not going to remember what it wrote. You can basically go chapter by chapter, but it doesn't have the memory capabilities to remember what it basically said in chapter 1.
It's like a goldfish.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's a very, very smart goldfish. They're working on that though. And so once it has that sort of
retention,
longer arc, that sense of history, that sense of memory, we really don't know what it's going to do. So it might be, I know that some authors, that's like Sarah Silverman, who's a comedian here in the States, is suing OpenAI because somebody could go in and say, type me a joke in the Sarah Silverman style. And it's short enough in terms of its memory. It can go analyze all of the content online for Sarah Silverman and come in and basically write a pretty good joke that sounds like Sarah Silverman. And she's saying, well, you're copying me. You're basically—
it's a gray area. It's a gray area.
Very gray area. And so once you get into the where it has memory, you could say, okay, now write me a Dan Brown novel based on this, right? In the Dan Brown style. And we're dealing with some legal issues that are going to take years to sort out. In the meantime, AI will continue to get stronger and more powerful and more comprehensive. And part of the challenge, I was listening to one AI executive, and he was saying that, there's the term singularity has been used in a lot of different ways. And one of the reasons I don't like the term is that there's multiple definitions of it, right? Depending upon who you talk to. But one executive said that in his mind, the singularity is that part when we're going over the event horizon of a black hole where we really can't predict what happens. And the singularity of AI is where we're basically at a point where we really can't predict what happens after that point. And his conclusion was he can't, and he's an executive with an AI company, a big one, and he can't predict past 3 years because the AI will become so powerful, it will become so prevalent, it will impact economics and war and governments and banking, and the intelligence of an AI will be so far beyond our own that he really doesn't have any way of predicting what happens at that point. And so we're kind of at a singularity point, or close to a singularity point now, where we can't see more than 3 years into the future.
It's crazy. It's so short. It's crazy. But
my friend Daniel, this has been delightful. I hope it's been interesting for you.
Oh, absolutely.
Not too dark, but
no. Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure to have you share your insights from all your experiences. And it's vitally important stuff to talk about. So, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.